All right, we're back with another team preview. Today, we're going over the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you have not checked out all the rest of the team previews, check out the team preview playlist. It's down below in the description. Also, make sure you sub and like this video. We're going to go over all 32 teams, so make sure you check these videos out. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers going over a major overhaul this offseason. New offensive coordinator, new quarterbacks. We saw our receiver get shipped out of town. So this offense is going to look a little different. And it starts at the offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith. We all know about Arthur Smith and his days in Atlanta. He makes things a little difficult for his fantasy guys, right? So this offense will look a little different. I'm sure the players will have their moments throughout. But Arthur Smith does change some things for this offense. Now we also got to figure out who's starting, who the lead back is, etc. So let's get into this team preview, all right? The quarterback carousel is obviously the headliner of this. We got to figure out who the starter is. So Russell Wilson, Justin Fields are now in the starting quarterback discussion. Last year, we had Mitch Trubisky, we had Mason Rudolph, we had Kenny Pickett. It was a lot of different quarterbacks in at times for this team, and it was probably tough for fantasy managers who had any Pittsburgh Steeler last year. Even though the team played decent, the quarterback situation was so fluid. But we get Russell Wilson and Justin Fields in there competing again. So a little bit, but I think we know who the starter is. And I'm assuming it's going to be Russell Wilson. Fresh off a strong season in Denver, he finishes the QB 14 at 3,070 yards, 26 touchdowns, only 8 interceptions. Also got a little busy on the ground, 341 rushing yards, 3 TDs there. So he got benched late in the season, and it wasn't because of his play. It was because the Broncos decided they had enough. So he was in that Sean Payton offense and played well. Still mobile, still had a strong arm. I think Russ still has it, and he's proven time and time again that he's at least been a QB2. For a majority of his career in Seattle, he was a QB1 for our fantasy teams, and now he'll still be a top 20 option at the quarterback position that will probably get later in drafts. So I think he'll still have a strong season, and the good thing for Russ is now he's paired with an elite receiver, just like he has been in the past. Those big receivers he likes is DK Metcalf. Courtland Sutton played well. We get George Pickens now here. So he has good weapons around him, good, strong run game. And for everything that Arthur Smith is as far as confusing for us, for our fantasy teams, he does know how to run an efficient offense. So I think Russ will be fine as a starter, and he'll have some promise. You may be able to get him later in drafts, which is a good thing. Get him at cost instead of like having to, to pay higher for somebody else. Instead of having to reach for somebody a little bit more upside, we might get Russ outside the top 20 quarterbacks, which would be an extreme value. The reason we might get him that low is because there's a competition. So Justin Fields is also in the competition for quarterback one there. Obviously traded from the Bears, had a good career there, but they decided they were going to turn the page and go with Caleb Williams in the draft this upcoming season. So they have Caleb. Now the Steelers have Justin Fields for the foreseeable future if they want to keep him after Russ is gone. He was a QB 18 in 13 games last season. So fantasy-wise, Justin Fields is always an elite option. He has elite upside. And he played decent for the Bears last year. It's like they got him DJ Moore. I thought for sure they were going to be, adding weapons for him this offseason. They decided to move on. So it depends on what happens with this Steeler football team, how things will go for the Steeler quarterback situation. I think if Russ gets benched or hurt, Justin Fields could be one of those players we're talking about as like a late season ad that's a league winner. But if Russ plays well the whole season, we're not getting anything out of Justin Fields. So I wanted to talk about him because last year he averaged on a per game basis the same as Mahomes. So even though Justin Fields is the backup inherently right now, there's still a lot of promise for a player who, say, week 8 comes around and the Steelers are tired of what they see out of Russ, or maybe they decided, we want to see what Justin Fields offers us as a starter. Or maybe he starts the season as a starter or something happens. Like, there's still a lot of promise, I think, fantasy-wise for Justin Fields. In real football, I think he's still got a little time to develop. He's going to need some years in this offense. He's going to need some more years of experience to develop as a passer and as a leader of a football team. But for fantasy, it's like he uses his legs a lot. This could be a really nice scenario if he gets a chance to start at some point this year. So don't keep Justin Fields off your radar just because he's the backup. All right, let's get into the running game. Obviously, one of the bigger question marks of this team is who's the starter at running back, right? We just talked about the quarterback scenario. The running back scenario is the same way. Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. And Najee Harris, let's start with him. He was the RB23 last year, fantasy-wise. He's lost some weight this offseason. A lot of complaints about his efficiency, right? Being under 4 yards a carry, even though he was over 4 yards this last season. This is a contract year. The team declined his fifth-year option, so obviously they want to see what they get out of Najee, who is an older back already. He had some terrible games last year, some very forgettable games, especially early in the year. 4 out of the first 5 games they played, he was under double digits. But he finished the season strong, and so he had 9 games total in double digits fantasy-wise last year, 8 under. The major concern with him is that he used to be involved in the passing game. Jaylen Warren has taken over a lot of that work. So he had 1,000 yards rushing, right? Like 1,000 yards last season, 8 touchdowns. But it's the receptions. He only had 29 catches, 170 yards in the passing game. And we're used to seeing Najee be somewhere like the 300 to 500 yard range when it comes to yardage, and somewhere around the 50 catch marker. And he was nowhere close. So that's the major concern I have with Najee Harris. Do I think he can replicate another top 20 to top 25 finish? Absolutely. Do I think Jaylen Warren is the starter? No. I think that Najee Harris will be the starter. And I think that Jaylen Warren will also play a very significant role, just as he did last season. So my guts is that this is still a 2-man committee. One of them is going to have better day than the other. Like, I don't think it's going to be a thing where we have both of these guys performing at top 20 levels, or one of them breaks out unless there's an injury. So part of why some of you are on this channel and watching right now is because you've seen my takes about Najee Harris and either agree with them, disagree with them, or may just be something that you remember, right? Like, we talked about Najee a lot last year. I still believe in Najee Harris, and I think that I will be watching this ADP very closely. Very closely. A guy that's motivated in a contract year, who's played well in the past. I will be watching very carefully to see if I'm going to be diehard Najee stan again, or if I'm going to move, if he goes in the try-hard category. The one thing I said I don't like, the catching, pass catching. I wanted to see that, and I think that that's gone fully to Jaylen Warren. So we'll see this offseason. We'll see. Jaylen Warren, RB22 last year, finished ahead of Najee Harris. Reminds me a lot of like Zeke and Tony Pollard, where Tony Pollard would come in and look really good at times as the backup, and then the starter was viewed as like the plotter and the touchdown vulture. Najee would be more touchdown dependent. Jaylen Warren is going to be more catch dependent, which is a good thing for PPR leagues. So he finished last year 784 yards on the ground, 4 touchdowns, 61 receptions, 375 yards in the air, 5 touchdowns. And, you know, he had 10 games in double digits, which is good, right? Like, his workload throughout the second half of the season slowly started to increase, and it truly became a backfield by committee. It was a true split at times. Some games we were getting Najee Harris looking like the lead back. Other times it was Jaylen Warren. So I like what Jaylen Warren brings to the table. I'm just not willing to put him over Najee. I'm sure they'll be drafted right next to each other. It'll be a pick your poison. Okay. One of them has more upside on a weekly basis. The other one's probably going to be more consistent. That first one being Najee, the second one being Jaylen Warren. Okay. I know he'll have some bigger games based on like big chunk plays, but the touchdowns are really what separates in fantasy. Najee Harris will have the first opportunity at those, in my opinion. So once we get down to the start of the season, we'll see who the actual starter is. If I had to make a decision today as of May, I'm putting Najee over Jaylen Warren. We'll see what the depth chart says game 1. Where it gets fun is at the receiver position, and really just George Pickens. That's where it gets extremely fun in this offense, man. He's on a trajectory to really break out this season. And I hope when you go to your drafts and you see George Pickens' names, don't be scared. Okay? Do not be scared of George Pickens. His last 2 games of the season last year, the last 2 he played in, 4 catches, 195 yards, 2 touchdowns in week 16. And in week 17, he has 7 catches, 131 yards. He hasn't been too consistent to start his career. That's been the one knock on George Pickens. Came up his rookie year, he was off an ACL injury. Last year, he looked really good, especially later down the stretch. And now Deontay Johnson is gone. The guy who was taking up a lot of the targets in this offense is now in Carolina. So you have another rookie who's taking his place. There's not really much depth behind George Pickens. They're going to ask him to do a lot. And Russell Wilson loves to lock in on his number 1 receiver. You know who else does? Justin Fields, as we saw with DJ Moore. So either way, they both have the deep ball in them, and they both can let it sling with the best of them, right? You got 2 quarterbacks. It's not like this is Trubisky and you're getting, Mason Rudolph. You're getting 2 good quarterbacks that can come in and potentially deliver the ball to George Pickens. He had 63 catches last year, 1,140 yards, 5 touchdowns. I'm expecting a major leap. I really am, in both receptions and in touchdowns. So it'd be a surprise to me if he didn't crack double-digit touchdowns, if he didn't crack 80 receptions. That would be a major shock to me in this offense. And with those kind of numbers, we're talking 1,300 to 1,500 yards for George Pickens. I think he has trajectory to be like a top 12 receiver this season at wide receiver 3 prices. So for me, I'll be big on George Pickens until he starts to creep into like the top 15, 20. If he doesn't get there, I think George Pickens will be a steal in drafts this year. One of my favorite buy lows, or I would say sleeper candidates, I would say this year in drafts. And then the team also drafted Roman Wilson in the 3rd round, kind of a smaller receiver to replace Deontay Johnson, 5'10", 186 pounds. He has a lot of speed, 4.39 speed. So this will be a guy that's his primary role is to get open as well. So we're probably going to see a little Deontay-esque type role in this offense. I don't expect the same type of targets like Deontay was getting, but primarily a similar role. Secondary receiver, one who's going to have to make himself available in this offense. So if you got Roman Wilson in Dynasty, I think this is a complimentary player at best. I never see him taking over the number 1 role. I think that's Pickens for the foreseeable future. So just know that Roman Wilson might have some upside as a starter, but there's not a lot of upside to be relevant fantasy-wise or like superstar capability unless something happens with George Pickens. And then the team, there's not a lot of depth on this team when it comes to receiver position. They also signed Van Jefferson in the offseason. So if you're looking for like who's the wide receiver 3, it's Van Jefferson. I don't really got a whole lot on him or want to spend any time on him really because he wasn't productive when he's had a chance to be a number 1 receiver or a number 2 receiver. It hasn't happened with the Rams, the Atlanta, like it just has not happened for Van Jefferson. So I'm out on Van Jefferson. If you want to take a dart throw on him, go ahead. But not I. And that last player to talk about on this team is Pat Freiermuth, who was a tight end 30 in 12 games last year. He was terrible. I had a lot of high expectations for Pat Freiermuth last year. I dealt with injury a little bit last year, but after a top 8 season in 2022, I was expecting like big numbers, like top 10 production out of him in this offense, and he didn't have it. So could there be a bounce back? Yes. Like this is the opportune time for there to be a bounce back for Pat Freiermuth. He only had 2 double-digit games last year, and Russ doesn't really, use his tight end a whole lot. We saw Fields use Cole Kmet, but he's going to have to elevate himself to the secondary target in this offense. I think he can do it, but that's just, we saw how Arthur Smith last year, he used Jonnu Smith at times, didn't want to use Kyle Pitts. We'll see how it goes with the Arthur Smith experience, but my gut is that he'll be much better this year, more of a high-end tight end 2 than the back-end tight end 3 he was last year in the 12 games that he played, all right? So that does it for the Steelers. I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.